Welcome to the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. My name is Aaron Harries. Wheats on Your Mind is brought to you by the Kansas Wheat Commission and Kansas Association of Wheat Growers. Our guest on this episode of the podcast is Kathy Brower, Lab Manager for Grain Crafts Innovation and Quality Lab in Manhattan, Kansas. The daughter of a Kansas wheat farmer, Kathy is a native of Manhattan, Kansas, and a graduate of Kansas State Universities with degrees in food science and industry and Spanish. Kathy, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Kathy, tell us a little bit about your background and your career path and how you ended up with Graincraft.
Oh, sure. So I grew up here, as you mentioned, in the Manhattan area, and my dad is a wheat farmer. He grew various crops. He's a fifth-generation farmer. So my grandparents had a small dairy operation and would provide milk to neighbors and friends in the region. And interestingly, on both of my grandmothers, on both sides, their families ran little general stores.
Really?
One was in Flush, Kansas, and the other one was in Paxico, Kansas. And so we kind of have this history of, the general store set up and helping people within the community. And so I do feel deeply rooted within the Manhattan area and within those communities as well. My pathway through college, I kind of had the farm background to work on and that agriculture background, but I thought I kind of wanted to go into pharmacy school.
Oh, really?
My mom is a health professional, so she's a registered nurse, and so I was kind of also interested in science and different things like that. And so when I decided to kind of pick a career path, I chose pre-pharmacy. Took all the credits for pre-pharmacy at K-State along with my Spanish degree, and then applied to pharmacy school. Didn't get in on my first round, and I'm not really one to sit around, so I was looking for things that I could do while waiting to reapply to pharmacy school. And I had looked up an article I'd seen on nutraceuticals and became really fascinated in this field of nutraceuticals and probiotics. Mm-hmm. And I thought, maybe there's a different pathway into this career, or something different that I want to do as far as more of a healing or holistic approach. And so I started looking up information on how I could get, a pathway or a career pathway in that area, and stumbled across Kansas State University food science. So at the time I had actually, graduated from K-State, and I was in Lawrence, and I was thinking, wait, I'm going to be headed right back to K-State, my alma mater, to finish out a food science degree. And so I talked with some of the advisors there in the department, was really impressed with the program, and I came back here and finished out a food science degree, and honestly just never turned back to pharmacy.
Yeah.
I really found my niche in this field, and it felt a little bit more comfortable to me because it tied in my agricultural background and those roots, and I just really, really kind of love this industry. With that, my first job out as a career was at Interstate Brands Corporation with Hostess Wonder Bread, and that was kind of the label at the time. And I worked there for a few years, and then had an opportunity to come back and work at the American Institute of Baking. I did about 4 years working in research and development, and then promoted into pilot plant management for about another 4.5 years there with the American Institute of Baking. From there, I just had some other job opportunities spring up. I worked at Worth, Texas for a while with Terrasol Ingredients, MS Biotech for a while in Wamego, and just have had a really great career. I got a chance to work here in the community for a while as a health inspector, which was a great way to get to know, different people within the community level, and just had a really good time with that.
So let's orient everybody. We're coming to you from the Kansas Wheat Innovation Center in Manhattan, and we've got office space, and if you go downstairs to the laboratories, you'll see Graincraft's Innovation and Quality Lab in the Wheat Innovation Center. So tell us a little bit about what the lab is.
So Graincraft Innovation and Quality Lab is basically our hub for varietal research that we do on different wheat varieties coming in. And we also have a space for a bake lab. We have space for kind of our new crop harvest survey, which comes to us typically mid-June through mid-October, we're running samples for new crop harvest, and those reports are generated for our different mill labs. And we also do some testing for breeding programs across the region and through universities and programs like that.
So you've really got 3 separate little micro facilities in the Wheat Innovation Center. So you've got a milling facility, kind of a flour lab, analysis lab, and a baking lab. So walk us through each one of those spots and what's done in each one of those spots.
I think it just makes sense to start out with the, bringing in the raw wheat kernels, and we do all of the analysis for that in our mill lab. So we'll bring in those wheat kernels, temper and clean them down, and then we will process and grind those on our Buehler experimental mills. And then from there, the flour that we grind from that goes into our flour analysis lab. And we have a variety of equipment in there for testing that we can do. And we can talk more about that too if you're interested in that as well, Aaron. But we'll run flour analysis. And then as soon as we have a good grasp on the flour analytical, we'll take that down to our bake lab. And we'll set up a bake from the information that we got on that flour analysis. And so we'll bake anywhere from typically in our busy season, it's about 12 loaves a day that we're baking. And we do duplicate loaves, but 12 samples a day is what we bake down in the bake lab.
So it's fair to say what you're doing here in your lab, you're all about quality control, aren't you? I mean, for a food ingredient, for how many mills does Graincraft have in the United States?
So we currently operate 12 mills in the United States.
Do you do the analysis for all those labs?
Quite a few of them, actually, and it just depends on kind of where they're at in the new crop harvest transition. But yes, potentially any one of those mills could send us samples for testing. We primarily in our lab like to stick to the hard wheat testing. It makes more sense for us because we're running bread. But potentially could we do a soft flour and run cookies? Yes, we could. I mean, we have the capability to do that here. But mainly, with our customer basis, a lot of it is around kind of the bread industry and that hard wheat industry. And so that's a big portion of the analysis that we do. And a big focus is on the quality for hard spring wheats and hard winter wheats. So that's really where our main focus lies.
So let's go back into the process a little bit. You're collecting samples at harvest time, I assume, starting down in Texas and moving north. Is it the mills that collect the samples, or do you collect those from farmers directly?
Well, we do a little bit of both. So we have samples that are coming directly to us from the mill, and we'll bring those in. They can send us samples all throughout new crop harvest, and we'll do an old crop versus new crop comparison for them, and we'll do that both on the kernel and on the flour that they're blending as well in the mill. But we also have a courier that goes out through the Kansas region, and so he'll start around mid-June when harvest starts, and he'll start collecting samples and just go regionally until typically about, I'd say, mid-August, we're still getting samples in from his collection. Those samples will come in, and those are weekly reports that go out, and we really try to kind of stay on top of that for our mills so that they have an idea regionally of what's coming in. Because any number of those varieties, wheat that is here in Kansas potentially could get shipped to Los Angeles, right? And so, I might have Los Angeles Mill calling me up and saying, hey, Kathy, can you tell me about, something that was milled in this region of Kansas? And they know that that's coming to them, so I can kind of give them a little warning about what's coming their way. That's part of the work that we're doing there. And then as we kind of get into the spring wheat harvest, that happens a little bit later in August, kind of through August, maybe October region. And those samples will be collected usually by the mill themselves. They have a courier that kind of goes out, and they'll come directly and bring them into the mill and then to us. And then again, we'll have farmers that are part of our preferred variety program that we run here. And those farmers are sending samples directly to us. They might be collected through elevators, and that potentially happens as well, or through different breeding programs that would send to us. But as well, we're also kind of handling those and then giving those reports back to them.
Yeah, we'll talk about that preferred variety program, but I'd like to jump a little bit more into the science because I know you can describe some of these tests in terms like layman, like I can understand. and so I'd like to talk about specifically in the flour analytical lab in the dough test. I think milling people understand those are just micro scale flour mills that mill it into flour. But tell us about like a farinograph, what that test is doing and how you analyze what quality means through tests like those.
Right. The farinograph is a really important test for us. And if I'm a baker, from a baker's standpoint, the baker is wanting to know how much water can I potentially put into this flour? And then what is the mixability of it? How strong is it going to be? How long am I going to be able to mix it out? And so the farinograph is one piece of equipment that can allow us to kind of give a heads up to those bakeries, and also as well in our own test baking scenario, what the performance of that flour is going to be. So you can picture a farinograph kind of like a little miniature mixing bowl. It has two paddles inside of it. And as you load flour in and then add water, it is measuring the hydration point of that water. And it's also turning those paddles, and the dough is generating torque against those paddles. And so it's taking a reading of that. As you hit peak development time, we can generate a number for that time. And we can also generate a number or a relative time in minutes to when that dough is going to break down. And that gives us a look at how stable that is on a dough system. And so it's a very useful test for us. So the way that we use that is we'll generate that stability time, and we'll take that stability time to our test baking, and we'll say, hey, we think we can mix this dough out for about 14 minutes, and we think it's going to have a 63% absorption. And that gives us our starting points for a test bake. But it's also very useful information for the bakery, because then they kind of have this idea of how strong that flour is coming in for them.
Yeah, Kathy and I have the benefit of we've both been in industrial scale bakeries, and some people may have not been, but you've got to picture a gigantic mixing vat where all the ingredients are put in just like a gigantic bread mixer would be. And so what you're talking about in terms of stability, water absorption, number one, water is the cheapest ingredient that can go into bread. But when you talk about breaking down or that dough falling apart, what does that mean exactly in that mixing situation?
You'll find that if you have a dough that breaks down, after a certain amount of mixing time, it's going to become very sticky, very soft, and it will virtually become impossible to remove from the mixer.
Okay.
And so, we're trying to mix a dough out to this nice development, this nice developed film into which it will still retain gas throughout the process of baking. So, you can imagine after you're dumping it out of the mixing bowl, it has to go through sheeting process, a molding process. It has to be, that's divided. And so it's going to go through these various, high stress scenarios. And you're going to need to have some strength behind that dough in order to get it through that processing. And so that's a lot of times where we're looking at protein quality. That's where that protein quality comes into play, and that's why we really stress protein as far as a quality attribute, because you can imagine it's just like kind of if you're bulking up for weight training or something, you got to have that protein coming in so that you can retain your strength. And it's very much the same with flour. So
at a bakery, which is basically kind of an assembly line, that's kind of the weak point there, right? If that dough can't mix and fall apart, it messes everything else up, and you probably get a phone call. Well, I know who gets the phone call. It's probably not you, but
technical team gets the phone call, and then, usually what happens is after that scenario, the technical team will work with the bakeries to kind of do some troubleshooting there on site. We have a great technical team. Charlie Nave and Dave Krishock are on our technical team, and they travel to all these different bakeries and are the boots on the ground to really see what's happening there on site. And then from there, they might send some samples back to us and say, hey, this would be something that we're looking at. Can you take a look and see what results you're getting on your farinograph here? And we'll further put it through our bake test and see if we're getting the same results that they are. And we can do a lot of communication and troubleshooting back and forth with clients.
You talked about protein. What, real quickly, what are a couple of the other tests you run in the analytical lab?
Oh, sure. So we run NIR imaging, near infrared imaging, and that machine gives us an initial moisture, ash, and protein content. And from that, we can use that to set up our farinograph test.
And what is ash?
Ash is the mineral left behind after you've burned off all the carbohydrates and all the protein. You can think of ash as kind of, if you have that outer layer of the kernel, that outer layer contains a lot of mineral content in it. And so when we're putting something through the mill, grinding that, part of that is always going to be present within the flour itself. Part of that, we can get a good idea of, how much, if we know our ash content, we can get a good idea of how well we're grinding, how well we're milling by that ash content inside of there. And so, typically with our patent flours, there may be around a 0.54 ash is kind of a common value for us.
Okay.
And that'll be specified as well by clients. Clients will specify how much ash they want in their product.
So that's really how they adjust their mills to get that certain ash. So then you move on to your baking lab, which is pretty impressive to see. Tell us what happens there.
Yeah, so the baking lab, that's usually where everybody likes to concentrate. I mean, it smells good for one. It really draws people into the area. That's where our students really enjoy spending a lot of their time too. We have different students that work with us from Kansas State University, and so we find that they really enjoy being a part of that process. But what we'll do is we'll take our samples, and we have what we call a sponge and dough process. And a sponge, what we do is we'll take about 70% of the flour, and that's going to go into a mixture with yeast and water. And we put that into a ferment process, and that's a 3.5-hour fermentation. And then what we'll do with that is we'll add the remaining 30% portion of the flour along with shortening, sugar, and salt to bring that back as a dough. So after 3.5 hours ferment, you'll add all the rest of the ingredients, and then that's what actually mixes out into the final dough. We feel like it gives us a really good look. If you're running a fermentation process, it gives you a really great look, first of all, at an initial stability for that particular flour, and so we can get some ideas from that, but also it gives us a way to judge, did we hit the correct absorption?
Okay.
So when you're looking at a sponge and you can either feel that it's too soft or maybe it looks a little overhydrated, or maybe it looks a little underhydrated and it feels dry and shaggy, that's a good way for us to be able to come back on the dough side and to make a quick adjustment on the dough side when we're finally mixing that out. And so it just gives us a quick diagnostic, an easy way to be able to hit our target, because a lot of times we're getting fairly small samples, and especially with any breeder samples that are coming in, you might not have a lot to work with. And so you really are trying to kind of hit that quality and that target on the first time that you mix that dough, because you might not have another shot with that particular variety. Mm-hmm. Whatever we can do to kind of try to optimize that dough in that moment, that helps us if we have that sponge available to kind of judge off of. From there, we'll mix everything out. We put it through a dividing step, and then we sheet the dough out. We run a trifold process on that, and then that goes through our sheeter molder. And a sheeter molder, you can kind of think of it as, maybe flattening out. It goes through a set of rollers, and it's maybe flattening out and taking out some of those air pockets and making a nice, smooth piece for us. And then from there, it's being molded into kind of what you would see as a loaf, a preliminary loaf, if you will.
And that's a very similar process in a commercial bakery, correct?
Very similar,
okay.
Yeah. And really, we are trying to mimic that process as closely as we can, because we want to simulate what they would potentially see in their system.
Yeah.
And so then from there we pan up the dough, and then it goes through about a 60-minute proof time and then into the oven. Once everything comes out of the oven, it cools overnight, and then we come back and evaluate it the very next morning. So you don't really ever want to slice into anything that's hot. It's not a good way to evaluate bread. And so the next morning we'll come in and immediately go through and slice and evaluate bread. And then we're looking at loaf volumes. We're looking at kind of the texture of the crumb and the grain. So all those things are really important determinants of, how strong that flour would be and how well it would perform.
Yeah, that's a great walkthrough of the process here, and it's a very complex process. So how many samples are you going to do that process with every year?
Well, this year we ran close to 1,300 samples.
Wow.
So yeah, and really the bulk of that comes from, like I said, from mid-June through mid-October. About a third of our samples come from new crop harvest. Another third of those were breeder samples and university sample from breeding programs at universities as well. And then about another third of those was generated from our QA mill labs.
So you're a busy person most of the year.
We try to be.
One of the advantages of having the Grain Craft Lab in the Innovation Center is we have a lot of people come through the building, and it gives us the opportunity to really play that food ingredient story, because farmers understand quality of wheat a different way, test weight and moisture. But now we can talk about the food ingredient part of that, the flour, the dough, the baking. What do you think are the advantages of being co-located in a facility like the Wheat Innovation Center?
Oh, it's a tremendous advantage. And I mean, honestly, I can't imagine having it a different way at this point. Before, our lab was located within one of our mill QA labs in Wichita, and so there just really wasn't foot traffic or visibility or really the ability to even go into that lab. Now, having us here with the Wheat Innovation Center, we can bring in various tour groups, and I really love making that connection with people that we've had classrooms come in. We've been able to have farmers come in, and even some of the farmers that have come in, they've got to see their specific variety baked out in our process and seeing the bread that has come from that. And so I really enjoy being able to walk everyone through the process and show them, this is, aside from this greenhouse and everything that's happening here, once we receive these kernels in, we can walk them through the process and show them that. And I just think it's a tremendous opportunity to be able for them to put those connections together.
It really completes the whole picture we're trying to tell here in the Innovation Center, because we've always talked about genetics, and now we talk about end-use quality, so it really completes the part of the puzzle. And we normally don't give Kathy too much of a heads up when tour groups are coming through. That's a disadvantage to her, but we've had anywhere from Chinese millers to famous football coaches. And
Bill Snyder, that was the best.
Yeah, Bill Snyder came in one day, and not to be surprised, he was fascinated by it, I believe. I think he really was interested in the X and O's, so to speak, of the food ingredients there. Let's talk about that relationship with wheat breeders. You do obviously breeder samples, not only from the breeders here at K-State, but from around the country. But that proximity here to K-State and the wheat breeders, how does that feedback kind of work in favor of both parties?
Yeah, so I mean, really, I feel like we couldn't run a program like a preferred variety program without the cooperation from the breeders. It's so important that we have those samples coming in year after year, because as you know, varieties are changing constantly. And so if we can get kind of that initial look at those, and those breeding programs are willing to work with us, it really does kind of help us make decisions for what can go onto that preferred list. And what that preferred list is varieties that we've seen that not only, it's very important that those perform well for the farmers. We want to make sure they have really good yield quality off of those, that they have drought tolerance and pest resistance and all those things built in that are going to make it, so the farmer can actually profit from those. But we also want to make sure that the quality of those is going to work out for our bakers. And so what we've seen by giving this feedback to the breeding programs, once they send us their samples and we can give them that feedback, it gives them a little bit of heads up, hopefully ahead of time for the wheat quality conference that we all attend. Gives them a little bit of feedback in advance of that, as well as, just giving us an idea of what is going to work well for that list. It's just been a really good relationship here with them. I mean, Oklahoma State University, they provide into our program, Kansas State University, Idaho State. And as far as that goes, we have several breeding programs that send us samples as well. They can send us samples as early as even August, and that's a great preliminary look at them ahead of all these wheat quality conferences that we go to, so that they kind of know what to expect for the year before those results even come in.
Yeah, you really are on the front line of making sure the wheat varieties that get released are good quality varieties. And that preferred variety program, I mean, there's more about that on the Graincraft website, I assume, but it's really top of the line varieties that make that list and go through that process. How long has that program been around? It's been 2 or 3 years now.
I think maybe more like 4 years, because I know Ruben McLean really heads up that program, and he's been with our company for quite a while. And I believe that, that was one of the first programs that, Graincraft, as they kind of brought out cereal food processors, that was one of the initial programs that they started with there. And that's kind of been his primary program there.
You're seeing more of the wheat crop in the U.S. than most people do. What's your general overall impression? I mean, we've had some climate situations the last couple of years here in the central United States, and we know environment plays a huge factor on the quality of wheat. But are there any trends that stand out to you in what you're seeing?
Typically on these drought years, we really do see protein content increase, and I think people are aware of that. But, we've had some really fantastic proteins coming out of, western Kansas this year. Whether that continues, maybe we have a little bit, we have a lot of ground moisture right now that's kind of happening due to the snowfall. So it'll be interesting to see how this year compares to next year. I mean, we have already got so much drought as it is, but, let's see kind of how that plays out. Typically, we really will see kind of a spike in that protein content in those drier climate years. So very high proteins, as far as it goes across Kansas, and, pretty high stabilities and high absorptions for the year. So whenever you've got a higher protein level, you're typically going to have a more stable product, and you're going to be able to put a little bit more water into that.
So I often talk to groups about protein quantity versus quality. So tell me, is that a real thing? How do you define that or tell that?
Essentially, when you're coming off the mill, if you have a 14, 15 protein on a hard red winter wheat, that's pretty amazing. And so, you're kind of looking at that thinking, we know there's some drought conditions. Let's kind of see how this plays out further along in the process. And so you'll take your initial reading, and really the way we kind of start understanding better what that quality is going to look like is when we get to the farinograph. And so when I get to the farinograph and I'm mixing that original dough, and I can kind of tell, hey, this says it's a 15 protein, but I'm not quite seeing the stability that I should on this one. And then as we get it further down into the bake process, if we're not seeing our volumes match up the way they should, if we're not seeing that mixability, if we're not able to grab our mix times on the mixer, that kind of all gives us the clues as to how that's going to perform. And, typically you would think, oh yeah, if it's high protein, it's always going to be a great performer. Well, that's just not necessarily the case. Usually you can get some good performance out of it, but you just, the stability is just not always there.
Kathy, tell us about the Graincraft Upstream Innovation Initiative.
Yeah, so upstream innovation is really about going to the source point. It's about going to our growers. It's about going to the wheat breeders, really discovering what issues they're having, discovering what agricultural practices that they're using, and trying to really work with them and understand better what challenges that they're facing. So, if we're not able to kind of put together those clues from them, then anything else that we do further down this process really doesn't matter, right? We as millers really want to understand the product, before it ever even comes into the mill. And so I think by working with these breeders and working with farmers, and we try to provide some resources as well for them. We partner with Shane New with Understanding Ag, and that's part of a regenerative ag program and practices program, that if we can kind of work with our farmers in understanding what their needs are, it's just going to be better for our industry in general.
Yeah, keeping those channels of communication open. And I know people who visit the Graincraft Lab at the Wheat Innovation Center usually leave with a newer found appreciation for Brett that they eat. Kathy, thanks for joining us on the podcast. Really appreciate it, and keep up the good work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to Kathy Brower with Graincraft for joining us on this episode of the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. If you have a topic you'd like us to cover or have a follow-up question for one of our guests, please email us at podcast@kswheat.com. I'm Aaron Harries. Thanks for listening.